The WWF games on the NES were, I wouldn't say hit or miss, more like miss or miss further. But how would they fare on the 16-bit consoles? Let's give it a shot. Much like the NES, there were 4 different WWF games released on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis: Super Wrestlemania, Royal Rumble, Raw, and WrestleMania the arcade game. I'm going to take a look at each game and see how they played out during this mid-90s era. The first one was Super Wrestlemania, released in 1992. And if you notice that it looks similar to Steel Cage Challenge on the NES, then that's not a coincidence. They both came out in the same year, and both were developed by Sculpted Software. In fact, all 4 of the 16-bit games were developed by them and published by Acclaim. Although there is a little caveat to the last one, but we'll get to that later. You can select one of 8 playable characters in the Genesis version, or 10 total on the SNES, although the rosters on both games were vastly different for some reason. You can play 1-on-1 matches, 2-on-2 tag team matches, or 4-on-4 Survivor Series elimination tag team matches. Plus, the Genesis version has a championship mode where you can run a gauntlet against everybody in the game to win the belt. Aside from your basic strikes, you can throw your opponent into the ropes, jump off the top rope, and fight outside the ring. You grapple up, which leads to a button-mashing mini-game. Whoever gains more momentum will apply a move like a suplex, headbutt, or a body slam. The Genesis version also has a signature move tied to each wrestler, giving some identity to each character, because it's not like everybody has different attributes or anything. The SNES version has the bigger roster and better graphics and sound, but it was more sluggish than the Genesis, which I think is better paced, and for some ungodly reason, you can't choose your opponent in the SNES version, whereas in the Genesis, you can choose or let the CPU decide. There are 3 levels of difficulty, and there's some nice details like the ring introductions and winner announcements by Howard Finkel, and the winner's theme music being played. I prefer the Genesis version just based on the flow of the gameplay alone. It's the only real trait that significantly is better on one side or the other, but both versions are still pretty good, and either way, it's a huge step up from the NES WWF games, particularly its counterpart Steel Cage Challenge, which was probably the worst one of them all. So Steel Cage was probably just an SNES game in an NES's body, which isn't a very good transfer. The other way around is easier to make work. Royal Rumble was the next one in line and would be released in 1993. This time the rosters have expanded to 12 on both consoles, although once again there are some differences between the 2 rosters, and shockingly, one of those discrepancies is Hulk freaking Hogan. He's not in the SNES version. You once again get 1-on-1 and tag team matches, but now you also get a brawl mode in 1-on-1, which is just a straight up fight until one of you runs out of health and passes out. The game does exclude the 4-on-4 elimination tag matches this time around, but adds the 6-man tag, or 3-on-3, which is not only 1 man less per team, but it's only 1 fall to a finish like regular tag matches, eliminating the elimination feature, so that's a downgrade. What is an upgrade is the addition of the Royal Rumble match itself, which would have been a dick move not to include it, seeing as how it's the name of the frickin' game. 2 wrestlers start the match off, and after an arbitrary amount of time, another enters, and you eliminate each other by tossing them over the top rope. It keeps going until everybody in the whole game gets out there and there's only 1 man left. You can only get 6 men in the ring at a time, maximum, so it technically doesn't ever become a full-fledged Rumble, but that's plenty, and it's really cool that the game keeps track of the Rumble stats and displays them post-match. The game looks and plays just like its predecessor, only now the graphics and animation are a lot smoother, and the controls feel much tighter too. Aside from the Rumble being the new match type, there's a small expansion of moves. You can smash your opponent with a steel chair, and even knock the referee down for a bit. Plus there's a whopping 10 levels of difficulty this time around, which is a bit excessive, but whatever. The grapple meter now has a visual aid, which comes in handy in at least knowing if you're even gaining any progress or not. The presentation has changed up a bit. The ring announcements are gone, although there is a text spiel that pops up before and after each match that kinda acts as the announcements, and Howard Finkel does get in the ring to raise the hand of the winner, although I always thought this looked more like Mean Gene Okerlund when I was a kid. I also like how you can listen to the wrestlers' entrance themes during the character select screen manually rather than just during post-match. Unlike Super Wrestlemania, the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions were virtually identical, aside from the rosters and some presentation details and such. It feels like the exact same game otherwise. Royal Rumble is a much more polished game than its predecessor, especially for SNES owners. The series was definitely heading in the right direction. As my grandfather once said, now we're cooking with oil. Next up was WWF Raw in 1994. Right away, you get a cool intro that mimics the opening of the OG Monday Night Raw intros on TV, so the presentation is already a plus. Just like in Royal Rumble, the roster is at 12 guys. Well, actually 11 guys and 1 gal, as Luna Vachon becomes possibly the first playable woman in a wrestling game, at least as far as I know. And this time the Genesis and SNES versions both sport the exact same roster. You get the same game modes as in earlier installments, but now the Survivor Series match returns in favor of the 6-man tag. And new match types include the Endurance match, which is a 6-on-6 gauntlet where you have to eliminate everyone from the opposite team one at a time. There's also the Bedlam, which is a tag team match where everyone's in the ring at once, and you have to eliminate both opponents. This time around, not all wrestlers are palette swaps. They actually have different attributes like power, speed, and stamina, giving them all some level of uniqueness. There's also an expanded set of moves, including these over-the-top ridiculous mega moves, as they're called. Perhaps the biggest addition is the ability to play up to 4 players with the multi-tap adapter. I've never done it personally, but I imagine this makes for a fun time amongst friends. The game otherwise plays nearly identical to Royal Rumble, although it is a little bit faster, especially the Genesis version, and especially if you pick the quicker wrestlers. It's not as much of an upgrade as Rumble was over Super Wrestlemania, but it at least expands on it a decent amount. Aside from the previously mentioned slight game speed difference and some other very minor aesthetic differences, there's really not much separating the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis versions. If you didn't have a WWF game on Genesis or Super Nintendo in 1994, Raw was a good option, but if you already had Rumble, I wouldn't have bothered getting this one on top of it. Finally, there was a port of WWF Wrestlemania for both the Genesis and Super Nintendo, renamed as WrestleMania the Arcade game. They were ported to other consoles as well, but to keep things consistent, we'll stick with the Genesis and SNES ports. This is a major departure from the previous games, as even though it is developed by Sculpture like the earlier games, this is still based heavily on the arcade game that was originally developed by Midway. Not only does that game look different, but it plays a lot different. So much so that you can easily say that this isn't even a wrestling game at all. It's really a fighting game that takes place in a ring. You just brawl with your opponent, once in a while throwing in a wrestling move or some crazy supernatural special move until they run out of health and you quote-unquote pin them. It's not like there's a 3 count or anything, you'll just cover them as a formality to stamp your victory. More proof that this is just a fighting game is the fact that it's best 2 of 3 rounds, like most standard fighting games. This can be fun in its own way, but for my money, if I want to play a fighting game on the 16-bit home consoles, there are better options. If I want to play a wrestling game, I'm going with any of the 3 previous installments in this video. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I like a little wrestling in my wrestling. Now that being said, if you get past all that and you just look at this game and play it for what it is, then yeah, it can be an enjoyable experience, particularly with multiplayer. The graphics look great, by far the best in this loose quadrilogy of sorts, and the animation is smooth as silk. But it all just seems out of place, like this engine was being built with something else in mind and the WWF got slapped onto it after. The game also lacks features. There's just the Intercontinental Championship and World Championship, which are two different campaigns with a different range of difficulty, which really just means that you're fighting more handicap matches in the World Championship. There's also less wrestlers to choose from here. It's down to 8 on Genesis and fucking 6 on Super Nintendo. 6? That's how many were in the original NES WrestleMania 6 years prior to this. I mean, for fuck's sake, the PlayStation 1 was out by this point, and actually ended up getting a port of their own of this game. So, yeah, not only did these games kind of have an identity crisis, but they weren't really long for the 16-bit world either. And that's how it all ended for the 16-bit WWF games. Just like the last couple games, there's not enough difference between the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions to really separate the two very much. Take your pick, or pick neither. And that wraps up this edition of Aqualung's Game Reviews. See you next time.